Hi, welcome to the My Community Earth Global Connections and Exchange Program webinar. This is the webinar on food security, vulnerability, and hazards. And I am Dr. Susan Gallagher-Heffron, and along with me this evening is Dr. Patricia Solis and Ms. Astrid Ng. And we'd like to welcome you all at whatever time you're joining us. We know that there's a random amount of times, and thank you all for those who are staying up late or those who are getting up early to join us. I think that's one of the fun things about working internationally is learning how to adjust with time zones and making connections with others around the world work. So today we are going to look at resources and topics and information about the MyCOE program and also about this specific theme. This is the third theme that we're covering so far in the project. If at any time, if this is your first webinar, if you look on the right-hand side of your screen, you should have a little control that you can submit questions or raise your hand. And if you're not seeing that, by clicking on, there should be like a little arrow that will pull that screen out for you. I just want you to know that during the webinar we will have time for where I'll ask you to submit questions, and last time we had somebody that had a trouble finding the question submission form, and it should be on the right hand side of your screen. There should be a little arrow with a tab that you can click on, and it should slide out so that you can see it. All right, with that we'll go ahead and get started. First of all, just a reminder that the Global Connections and Exchange Program has activities that focus on exchanges with classrooms around the world about geography and sustainable development topics. And in this particular program, we're focusing on three main themes: climate change, the green economy, and food security, along with vulnerability and hazards. And so today we're talking about the third theme. The main outcome of this project is to have youth projects that are conducted using a 5-step MyCOE approach, and to have those projects done in collaboration with other youth around the world, and then sharing them via the GeoPortal so that the students can exchange and comment and question each other and work collaboratively, maybe even replicating projects or commenting and asking questions about how students in one place did their project. So there's kind of twofold. One is the teachers are going to do the projects with their students, and most importantly, that the students are going to exchange then with other students and create a dialogue and a conversation about these themes and these topics in relation to their local observations. So our participating sites in the project are besides the U.S., the Philippines, Nicaragua, Bolivia, and Ghana. We have push pins kind of showing where people are. We have staff in Panama as well as Australia and Washington, D.C. So we are covering a lot of territory in the world. This is a graphic that shows the connections between the sites. So as you look at it, it shows the different U.S. state geographic alliances that are participating, and then the locations in the other countries: Nicaragua, Ghana, Bolivia, and the Philippines. First of all, let's start tonight talking a little bit about food security. And the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, which is sometimes recognized by the initials FAO, at a World Food Summit in 1996 defined food security as existing when all people at all times have access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food to maintain a healthy and active life. And it's interesting as you start to do research actually out on the internet about food security, it is more than just having access to food, but it's also the availability of the food, the access to the food, and use of the food. So sometimes we may have a lot of food production in globally. The data may be very good supporting food production globally, but there are areas of food insecurity due to maybe one or more of these other factors. And so I think sometimes it's helpful to remind students that there are certain factors that will impact a particular crop or a particular place differently. And we can talk a little bit more about some of those local examples as we go along. And hazards are, can be, what we're talking about here are natural hazards, things that happen in the physical world, a naturally occurring event that will have a negative effect on people or the environment. Now, there can be many natural hazards that are interrelated. For instance, an earthquake can cause a tsunami, and a drought might lead directly to famine. Now, a lot of times people say that hazards are things that happen in the natural world, and they really wouldn't be a hazard or a disaster unless people were in the way. So from a geographic standpoint, when we talk about the intersection of the physical system and the human systems and how people interact and modify and adapt to their environment, this is a lot of times where we can start to see hazards. And they are numerous in different locations, might have different susceptibility levels. One of the more prevalent hazards that's encountered almost all over the world is flooding. And there are other numerous types of hazards that occur, from storms and weather related to tectonic activity to different kinds of place-specific hazards that might be a result of the geology or the topography of a particular area. And I'm even thinking about limestone karst topography that might have sinkholes or some kind of other hazard that is a direct result of the type of land where people are located. Now, we're talking a little bit also when we talk about food security, and then we talk about hazards and how those can turn into disasters by the large number of people that are impacted by this. Then in the intersection of these two things are where the vulnerabilities lie. People could be vulnerable to food security issues with different risk factors for drought, maybe for insect plagues, maybe for limitations or political unrest. There are a lot of things that can affect food security. And hazards might also be, again, they can be random and weather related. They might be susceptible to a specific place just by the geography of that particular place. So it's good to point out, I think, to the students that these things are connected when you look at them and you start to look at the vulnerabilities. And sometimes hazards can actually connect directly to food security because they can actually impact that. For example, after the earthquake and tsunami in Japan and the nuclear plant that has leaked a lot of radiation in the food chain, they're measuring milk, grass, all kinds of vegetable products and also fish in the ocean. Kelp, seaweed, they're monitoring all of this now for radiation levels. So that one hazard has affected food security and created additional risk to the food supply in this particular area of the world. So I guess this is just a graphic to kind of try to illustrate that. It might be helpful to use with students so that they understand connections. So we've created, again, a resource page for the teachers to learn more about food security, vulnerability, and hazards. We've listed out some resources, and I'm going to just go over those quickly here in just a little bit. There are some classroom modules and case studies that are available, and we'll also go over those quickly. In the online tools section, there are some really neat tools that we were able to find. One, a Global Hunger Index, one, the FAO Global Livestock Production and Health Atlas, which has an interactive map, and also a global assessment report on disaster risk reduction. Now, some of these, and then also ideas for youth exchange projects. So with that, what I would like to do at this time is to leave the PowerPoint and to go to our resource page. This is on the MyCOE site, and the address for this is www.aag.org/GCE food security. And the first section is the teaching and learning about food security, vulnerability, and hazards. And that section is posted with a list of resources that are online. Some of these are from the UN and the Committee on Food and Agriculture, as well as the USDA. Feed the Future is also a resource that comes out of the USDA. There are a lot of resources there. And then also the United Nations has additional resources on hazard management and disaster reduction. So teachers can use these resources primarily to kind of get up to speed with what are some of these issues. And as we're talking about these different topics, I guess I have one poll for you, and that is, I would be curious about whether you are currently teaching about food security in your classroom. So go ahead and vote on the poll. We have about half of you that have voted. Some quick answers coming in. A little more than half are saying that they are teaching about food security at this time. We're almost got everybody voted. Go ahead and send your response. Okay, and we have about 75% saying that yes, they do teach about food security. Now, sometimes if you may think that you don't teach about food security, but it's very closely connected to a lot of topics that you may be teaching about. If you're teaching about urbanization, the land use and change in land use, this could also be connected to food security in the way of changing agricultural land or arable land to urban development. You might also teach about food security when you teach about population issues. There are very strong connections there, and you would probably be able to make some other connections also just on the about I would say as you are teaching, you might think about economics, connections, networks, shipping, transportation, any of those topics, if you're teaching about those even in an economics course, you may be able to easily connect in food security. So these are just some ideas about, you may think that you don't teach about food security, but if you're teaching about some of those other things, it can be very easily and quickly tied in to these other topics. Okay, and as we're going through this, now we're also looking at the some of the risk and hazard management resources, and I would like to find out how many of you teach about hazards in your classroom. So if you respond to the poll, oh, and it looks like, interestingly, hazards are taught more often than the food security issues. Okay, everybody's voted. So about 82% of you are saying that you teach about hazards. I know when I was teaching, my students were always interested in earthquakes, volcanoes, hurricanes, anything with a lot of things blowing up, falling down, moving around. They were usually interested in that kind of thing. But then making connections even between what happens after the disaster. It just isn't about the disaster and where it happens, but then how do people manage? How do they adjust for risks? How do they try to mediate those risks with planning and preparedness? And in many cases also food and clean water become paramount after some kind of a disaster. So again, the connection between these things is easy to include. If you're already teaching about disasters or hazards, then you can probably also connect food security into that by talking about vulnerability also. So we do have some modules listed here that you may be interested in exploring. And again, these are just suggestions and ideas to get you thinking. Of course, a teacher always needs to modify them for their own site and situation. And then, like I said, I do have some online tools that I want to show you. The first one that I have right now is the International Food Policy Research Institute. This is an interesting interactive map that will let you get information. It's a global hunger index report. And interestingly, this shows this data over time. And I found that to be very interesting. Right now I have the Philippines up. We can go click on other locations. This should show us the data, I believe, for Ghana. And let's try Bolivia. There's Bolivia's data. Let's try Nicaragua. Oop, not quite. There we go. And so by clicking on the map, you can get data for some of these different world regions. And it will let students look at their own region in relation to others as well. This next map is a global livestock production and health atlas. And when it lets you choose different types of livestock, this particular map is showing us sheep density. But if we wanted to, we could also look at poultry. We could also look at pig or hog production, and we could look at cattle. And you can kind of get an idea of where a lot of cattle production is the density is happening. This data is 2005. And I would have to know more about the specifics of how they're processing the data, because some of the data up here in Canada is actually a little surprising to me on that one. But it does let you look at data from a different perspective and also at a global scale. Now, this next online resource that we have is the Global Assessment Report on Disaster Risk Reduction. And there are several different variables that you can click on, and you can get the data for each country, and it's a histogram of the data here, so you can see the different values and how it's valued based on where you are on the graph. Or you can also click on specific countries and you can get the information based on the values that are there for each country. So this again is interesting, and I think that one way to think about using this with students for exchanges is to look at your information and come up with 2 or 3 questions about why you think it is the way that it is, and then exchange with another classroom and ask, you know, the other classroom using the exact same resource, you know, what's the value in your country, and what are the reasons why you think that you might have that value, or ask them to answer the same 2 or 3 questions. And this kind of starts an exchange. This is one way that you can start having the students look at similar data from similar times. Some of the data that I was finding is really between 1996 and 2005. I was having a little bit of a hard time finding a lot of resources that were newer. There was a lot of data up until 2002 and older data, but have them even question, you know, what is the data sources, why are those dates, you know, there, who's collecting the data, and, you know, how can we talk about it in our classrooms, how can we exchange or ask others about it. So some of these online tools might be for the students to look at their own location, but then to generate questions that they can share with others. So even getting teachers starting to think about how would these online tools not just allow the students to gather data about their own location, but then to have them think about it in terms and ask other locations to see if their explanations or questions are the same or are they different. And then there are some ideas here about how students might start a project. And again, once these projects get started and the students are working on them, remember the goal is for them to share their findings, their observations, their questions with others who are working on projects in the same theme. And so it isn't just that the students have to you know, the project is great for them to do at their location, but then taking it a step further, sharing that information, questioning with it, getting others involved, and thinking about these questions in terms of their own individual locations is one goal of the project. Now I'm going to go back to our presentation. And just as a reminder, in case this is the first webinar that you've been able to join us for, we are encouraging and trying to focus our projects around a modified scientific method called the MyCOE approach, where you formulate a question. Now, this question can come from current events, but the question might come from one of these online tools. As you use the tool and you let students look at this data and interact with the graphs and charts, they might start formulating questions about these topics just using online data. And so look for where we can find questions, find things that are worth investigating. Then that's the next step, is to observe, acquire data, find out more information, do some analysis, and then seek a solution or propose an idea, and then share that idea to intervene and change. Because it is interesting, as students start these projects, they get very engaged, and sometimes just looking around and seeing what's going on in your local community will connect you with some of these very topics. So for project ideas, like I said, you might be able to find or start thinking of questions based on the topics that we looked at from the online resources. You might also start looking for local observations on food security, vulnerability, and hazards. Maybe your area has recently experienced a drought or possibly flooding. What are the current crop conditions under which agriculture is being conducted right now? What are market prices? Are there outside forces that are impacting changes on where food is bought and sold or exported or imported? You might even look at urban development, where if there's a conversion of farmland to urban uses, population study, the amount of population and percent of growth that's occurring in the local area might also be an indicator that would have some impact on agricultural use for food production. So right now, what I'd like to do is to have you all think about what are some topics that would be relevant in your local area around this theme of food security, vulnerability, and hazards. Can you think of anything, and would you be willing to enter your topics into the question window and just hit submit? I'm going to read these off because maybe something that's happening where you are has a connection to someone else who's participating in the webinar, and let's share some of these ideas. Okay, we have a question that said, would it be possible to work on earthquake patterns in the Philippines, how they might affect agricultural supplies? I believe the Philippines are right on the Pacific Rim. And actually, I know that at Rochelle's school is right next to a seismic center where they actually conduct measurements. I remember seeing that. So Rochelle might be a great contact if you're interested in looking at how much activity is going on there. Also projecting food demand. Okay, that's an idea that just popped in. As you have a fast-growing urban center, predicting possible the amount of food that you might need. Okay, those are good ideas. Along with that, I might also question or ask the students to start thinking about, would the crops change? Like, for instance, I actually grew up in a very rural farming area of central Nebraska. And, you know, when my dad was growing up in that area, a lot of the farmers were all farming wheat. But after about, I would say, 1960, 1965, and some of the huge irrigation projects that came through running reservoirs and canals, all of a sudden dryland farming that was best for wheat farming is now all corn production in this particular area. So you might even ask students, you know, how might different crops that are grown change? Will it always be wheat, or do you see technology maybe changing to corn? Maybe after so much water use, it might be a good idea to go back to wheat that's a less water-intensive crop. Here's another idea that talks about interconnectedness of the economic impact of disasters as far as transportation networks, shipping and trade, and it looks like different industries that might be shipping things that are affected by a natural disaster, and then the economic impact of that, and also who does it impact and where, because we're so connected globally. I think the example here is even cars that were produced after the tsunami in Japan. How many of the industries, Subaru, Honda, Toyota, were maybe not exporting at as high as rate. Another topic that somebody submitted is how land conversion affect the yield of agricultural crops. Yeah, and that might be interesting too. Maybe will there be change based on technology or just crop rotation, and how would that impact something? An interesting thing here is that in Queensland, the cyclone came through last, I believe, January, and essentially wiped out the banana crop. So since last March to, I would say, through almost August, bananas were $17, $18 a kilo. And just now, as the banana crop is starting to recover now, we're buying bananas. They're back down to about $3 a kilo. But that price would kind of be about, it was about $2.92 for one banana. So that's a very different cost, but it's because of imports. There are no imports of bananas here, and also because of this natural hazard, the cyclonic storm that impacted that particular crop. So luckily, there are a lot of other things to eat here also besides just the bananas. But having students look at those local examples, why do you see a sudden change in a price in the grocery store for produce? A lot of times students are a little oblivious because they may not do the shopping, and their food purchases may not be in the produce department. But it would be good to have them stop and look at that once in a while, and then also to interview maybe their parents or grandparents that are purchasing and shopping for food and produce to see if there are any fluctuations or unusual patterns in the food prices that are available. Anybody else have any other topics on food security? Okay, another one just popped in pertaining to the production of oil palm and the food security of a staple food in Mindanao, and then with respect to the conversion of land. Okay, and another couple popped in, so I'm going to finish reading this one. Yeah, I think it's interesting as land use changes, whether it's for urban development or it's for another crop or it's for food crop to cash crop. Remember, it can still be agricultural, and there could still be issues or impacts on the food supplies just because of the use that the particular crop is. And somebody's also asking about marine biology. Yeah, I think there's some interesting topics actually with food security and fisheries. I think that there are fisheries that they're trying to protect. I know that some places are trying to protect some of the fisheries by instituting seasons when you can fish, when you can't, to try to protect breeding patterns and locations in order to ensure some of the fisheries. And that's definitely a major world food source. Another topic would be to have students look for, they may not be affected directly by an event or a hazard, but they could be affected by a secondary hazard. And the example here is maybe you aren't affected directly by a hurricane, but you might be affected by resulting tornadoes that are a weather-related event to that one big storm. Yeah, and in addition to fisheries, you might also, there are probably also marine aquaculture topics also. Or marine farming, whatever people are trying to manage as far as marine resources. Definitely, that would definitely be a good one. Okay, now these are all good examples. I think people are thinking along the ideas of what is, a good example, what is relevant to my location. And so as you think about these topics, then you might start thinking about how can student exchanges, what will the students do? And they can share their local observations and results, and they can also share new resources. If they find a resource that's very informative and helps them construct their project, then maybe it would be a really good idea if they share that resource along with the same questions to other groups and let other groups respond and create an exchange. Another idea can be that the students can conduct exchanges around asking questions about local conditions, the results of projects, but also how-tos. How did you do your project? What steps did you do? How did you conduct your project? Maybe we would like to replicate that project in our location, and we might have very different outcomes, but it might be very similar. So I think that that would be also an interesting option. So think about how we can start getting the students to think about exchanging and having a conversation and a dialogue with others on these themes. Now, as we move along, and you might be looking for a resource, or if you find a resource, the ones that we put on the GCE page are to get you started. There are things that we've found while we've been looking, and it doesn't mean that that's all that's out there, or those are necessarily the best, but they're to get you started and to give you a starting place to get you focused and seeing what is possible, what is out there. But there are a lot of other resources that you may know about. Some may be at your national level that provide data that if you share that resource, someone in another country may be able to also find out whether that data is available in their country. You may be able to get new resources that actually are helpful to others just by sharing them in the knowledge community. And that's what the knowledge community is about. And so just a reminder that at the conclusion of this, I will post a new discussion thread on this theme. So if you have ideas or resources that you've found, you can post those in the knowledge community and look for exchange topics also, and look to see what teachers are posting on these particular themes as they start doing projects with their students. And also, Astrid asked me to mention that some people have not maybe logged in yet to the knowledge community, and we would really like to make sure that everybody has access to this, and we have all the accounts set up, but we aren't able to test them. We want you to be able to do that. So if you would be sure and log into the knowledge community at least once so that we know that your information, your login information is working, then we'll be able to make sure that everybody can get access to the postings and the information that are coming through the knowledge community. We are customizing this, so we're even changing some of the titles so that we have information about projects, about discussions, exchange space for you, and also resources. There's a library, a place to upload files. This is the place where if you find something good, please do share it, because that exchange is what's going to help us help each other and also help the students get really engaging projects. So there is my information on the knowledge community. And again, just a reminder, here's a slide of our sites and the participating sites where you might find places to exchange. And the ways that you might exchange, you might want to work on a webinar. This is what we're doing right now for teachers. But there's the online communities, the knowledge community. That's the screen that I just showed you. Check there for exchanges, mentoring, logistics, files, resources, and also discussions. The geographic technologies and learning resources, and we'll have more about that in our January webinar, and that will be coming up where we'll go over some of the exchange and places of how to conduct your projects and exchange. The e-learning platforms, Moodle, some of the Center for Global Geography Education, those modules, if you want to conduct an exchange and use Moodle, which is a course management software, we can arrange an account if you request it. You can also do video conferencing via Skype or OVO, and that allows more than one classroom to connect at a time. And then also we're posting things also on Facebook and Twitter and in our GeoPortal pages. So all of these things will be going on in order to help facilitate those exchanges. And that's a great segue into the advertisement for the next webinar, which is January 10th after the holidays. We'll be convening and talking about how do we conduct student projects, what are some of the lessons learned. I have two panelists that are going to be joining me for this particular webinar. Dr. Phil Klein and Waverly Ray, who have both worked on the Center for Global Geography Education with the AAG. They've been actually piloting and conducting research on the exchanges and looking at the student interactions. And they'll be sharing some of their observations and some of their tips on getting students engaged in exchanges. And also at that time, we're going to look at some of the tools and resources that we have for conducting those as well. So that will be on January 10th. And again, we have a different time so that we can try to reach out to as many different time zones as we can. And now is the time for questions. If anybody has additional questions on this topic. Okay, we have a question. Is it possible to integrate green economy with food security, like the potentials of new farming practices on developing countries like the Philippines for higher productivity? I would say yes, if that's something that you know, you can do. You might even say, well, an interesting example is that I just heard about recently in the U.S. is some of the very strict zoning that is around the city of Portland, actually. and they're doing this on purpose to try to keep agricultural areas around the urban area and to keep the urban areas walkable and more organized rather than sprawl, and then to also keep a ring of productive farm ground around the city to provide fresh produce and food security. So I would say, you might be able to look at the green economy with building the built environment, how doing that, planning a good built environment can also increase food security. Those two things might be able to be linked, I would think. Another question, will all countries be represented in the international research gathering in Brazil? At Rio Plus 20, definitely will be showcasing the exchanges. And so as we work through these things, I think the thing that we'll be looking for to pick the projects are the ones that have a lot of student exchange and activity, a lot of times where the students are actively involved, where we see a project topic taking off. And as we see those as staff, one thing that we can do is to actually send out notices saying, here's a neat project that is going on, and you might want to also participate in the exchange or join by starting replicating the exchange. So it might not be just that you necessarily are joining, but it might be a very hot topic that students are very interested in, and it would be something that you could replicate in another place. So we'll be looking at all kinds of things like that in getting ready for Rio Plus 20. Also for the teachers, just a reminder that we did send out a link to an online survey, and we are surveying teachers before the project, and then we'll survey the teachers at the conclusion of the project. So we want to have a good response rate on our survey. If you haven't responded to that survey yet, if you would take just a few minutes, there's not a lot of questions, but if you would take just a few minutes and respond to the survey, that would be very helpful. Okay, any other questions tonight? And I'm saying tonight because it's night here in Adelaide, but I realize I'm watching the timestamps coming in for those of you who are also in the morning. Okay. If we don't have any other questions, then thank you so much for participating. And again, if you need more information or if you need to review any of this, you can go to the GCE web pages, which is at www.aag.org/GCE. The webinars, when the webinars are posted, the link to the webinars are posted on the calendar page, so that if you've missed this or if you have teachers that maybe contact you because they were unable to participate, the link to the webinars that are recorded will be posted on that calendars page, and so you can always access them from there. So just remember that website, www.aag.org/GCE. And that will get you to all of the information and resources that you might need. So thank you so much, and that'll be the conclusion of our webinar. And I look forward to connecting with you again in January. I hope everybody has a great holiday season, and a Happy New Year to you, and we'll look forward to talking to you in January.
But fortunately it looks